Hello, my most amazing artists. Today, you are going to get your ceramic city back out of the kiln. Now, it's super important that you're very careful with this city because it's super fragile. Now that it's out of the kiln, it's almost like glass, which means it can break like glass. A lot of you also have cities that can stand up. That means that when you're laying it down, you also want to be super careful. Or if you're standing it up, don't bump the table because if one falls, they might break. And we cannot glue them back together today. Now, if something does break, that's okay. We'll be able to glue it back together after we paint it. So that will be next class. But do me a favor and just be really careful with these. Treat it like it's glass because it basically is. It's super, super special and it can break very easily. So we want to always hold it with two hands if you're carrying it or if you're picking it up to paint, or have it flat on your mat. All right, today we're going to be using something called glaze. Glaze is like a paint, but it's a paint for clay. It's a special type of clay paint that after it goes back into the kiln, that hot oven that gets to 2,000 degrees, we're going to paint it, and after it goes back in, it turns really, really shiny. So that is why all of your paints or your glazes are labeled. This one says red because it might look a little bit different than it does when it comes out of the kiln. I made these to show you what each color looks like after it comes out, and I'll leave these up on the board so you can see them. But it's super important that you see that how many coats you have matters for how bright that color is. So one coat doesn't really show up too well. Two coats, like 2 layers of paint, you can kind of see it. 3 is the winner. You want to have at least 3 layers or coats of glaze to show that really, really bright color. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start glazing. I want to show you all the colors. Please try to keep the color lids back on the right color because we don't want to confuse anybody. This purple kind of looks a little pink. It might not look so purple, and this pink kind of looks purple. So it's super important you keep the lids on the right ones and that you share them at your table. Also, we're going to be using brushes, but we won't have any water to wash our brushes. When you need to change a color, just use a sponge and wipe it right off to change your color. We're not going to use any water because if you add water to this glaze, it won't work very well. Now, like I said, these are going to be going back into that kiln, so we want to make sure that we finish today so there's enough time to bake them one more time before the art show. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start thinking about what colors I want my buildings or my city, but as I'm doing that, I want to tell you a little bit about what's happening in the kiln. So why it's important to get this glaze and have it 3 coats and go back in the kiln is because when we paint it today, that's not what it's going to look like. It goes back in there and then that's how it gets all glassy and shiny. So it's kind of like baking a cake. You don't have a cake right away just because you mix the ingredients together. Just because you mix together the chocolate, the flour, all those things, you don't have a cake yet. You have to bake it. It goes through a process. Well, just like that, your city is going through a process kind of like baking a cake. So this is just the last step to get it all nice and pretty and ready to go for the art show. We're only going to paint the front of our city. It's okay if you get a little bit on the sides, but we're going to just paint the front of it. So I'm going to paint my buildings all different colors, but you don't have to. You could paint them all one color, but every time I paint, I make sure I get into all of those little cracks. You'll also notice that it dries really, really quickly. So that's awesome because you want to make sure you do 3 coats of glaze to get that nice dark color. Don't forget that when you're painting, if you want to change the color, all you gotta do is wipe it on that sponge there. You don't have to get the sponge wet. All you gotta do is wipe the brush bristles. Now I'm changing colors, and I always want to make sure to put the lid back on the color, not only so other students don't get confused about what color they're using, but also because they could dry out really easily. As you saw, at one of mine looked a little dry. Changing my color, so I always wipe my brush, always put that lid back on because remember, these colors might not look the same when they come out of the kiln. I'm painting a pink on right now, and right now it doesn't really look too pink. It's pretty dull. It's not too bright, but when it comes out of the kiln, it'll be super shiny. Now you have to make sure you put 3 coats of glaze. If you don't, it won't show up as well. Make sure you get into all of the cracks, especially if you added a lot of texture. You want to make sure you really get your brush down into all of those windows and doors. If you want to paint them different colors each, you can, but remember that today is the last day to paint these cities because next week is our art show and we have to have them ready. So today, I want to be able to put them in the kiln when you're done. So make sure that maybe you just decide to pick a different color for each building. Because you have to put 3 coats on, it kind of takes a little while. So if there's some things you want to paint details on, like maybe I could have painted my clock a different color, I could have painted maybe some windows different colors, but I would paint them at least one color first. If you want to paint the entire city all one color, go for it. That's fine too. Then you could go back with a few colors and go in with some details. But no matter what, all of it has to be covered in at least 3 coats of one color. I decided to paint each one of my buildings a different color, but I always make sure that after it dries, and it dries really quickly, I go ahead and paint that second and then third coat on there so I know it's going to be nice and shiny when it comes out of the kiln. All right, one more thing is you're gonna notice that this glaze does smell a little funny. That's because it has all of these things in it that have to bake in the kiln to make it look glassy and shiny. It might smell a little funny because of those things that are in there. They come from the earth, just like the clay. It's all natural. Sometimes it smells a little funky. That's all right though. So today we wanna make sure that you glaze your entire city. Don't leave out anything unless you are doing that on purpose. Make sure you use 3 coats. Make sure you always wipe your brush in between colors. Do not mix those colors. Also, keep it on your messy mat while you're working. That's why it's there. It doesn't matter if you get glaze onto the messy mat, but try to keep it off your table. Also, try to keep it off your clothes and your hands. You'll notice it's super dry, doesn't really feel that nice, and also it's super expensive. It's really special. It costs a lot more than paint does. Miss Q spends about $200 on that glaze that you guys are using, and I usually don't let first graders use it, so you guys are extra special that you get to use it on your cities today. All right, artists, remember, you're just painting the front. If you get a chance to paint the tops of the buildings like I am right now, or you could do the back, you could, but I don't think we're gonna have time for that. Also, it creates a problem when I put it in the kiln. I would have to stand it up if you paint the back because anything that you paint might stick to the kiln. So I'm gonna lay mine in the kiln flat like this so that the glaze side goes up. But if yours stands up really well, then you could paint both sides. But it's up to what you have time for. Definitely start with the front and finish that. If you have time to paint the back or even think about that, then go ahead. But as you can see, I'm fast forwarding here and it still took me quite a while. All right, putting all the lids back on, and I think that's all the reminders I have. Other than, yes, you will need to share that tray of glaze on your table. All right, artists, have fun today.